Julie Del Tenno is your maiden name, subsequently Segalla.
Right.
I like to start out chronologically because it's one way to get memories flowing easily. So why don't you tell me about your earliest childhood? Were you born in Canaan?
I was indeed.
Okay, and Del Tenno would suggest an Italian background?
It was. Okay. My mother and father both came from Italy.
So they were among the original immigrants that came to Canaan. How did they happen to come to Canaan?
My father's uncle had been here. There were a group of people that had come from the northern part of Italy to work primarily in the lime kiln. And my father's uncle, Santo Del Tenno, had come in the early 1900s and had lived with several families. The Gaddis were here, the Dellones were here, Gasparinis and Rivas, and quite a few of those folks. And he came, and then once he was established here, he called for my father to come. And my father came from the northern part of Italy, Sondrio, which is the name of the province, and he met my mother on the boat. They left from Genoa. Yeah, it was. It's a nifty story. They met on the boat. My mother's father had been living in Washington, Pennsylvania. He was a brick maker. And he had come and settled in Washington, Pennsylvania. And then the time had come that he had saved enough money and he was bringing his wife and children. And my mother was on the same boat. My father came by himself with no other members of the family to meet with his uncle here in Canaan. In the meantime, when he first came, as I said, he'd met my mother, and they developed a relationship. My father had gone to Ohio originally because he had friends and from the same part of Italy, and he became involved with families in the Ohio area, but also the Pennsylvania area because he wanted to be near my mother at that time. He had come as he had gone to school and learned to be an electrician in Italy, and so he came already having a trade, a business, and had completed his education. And so they eventually married. In fact, they married in Pittsfield. There were people in Pittsfield and Schenectady that were distant. They called them relatives, but they truly weren't. They were relatives in the fact that they came from the same town. And so they moved to Pittsfield for a bit, and then they came on to Canaan, and he became one of the first electricians in the electric power company. At that time, it was Connecticut Power Company. And my mother proceeded to live here, and after they were here 3 years, I believe, I was born. And at that time, it was interesting because we never grew up knowing there was a depression. It was only as I became older that I realized that we had been raised during a depression.
Really?
But being resourceful people, most of the Italians had come from such poor living. You know, the economy was so poor at that time in Italy. They were extremely resourceful people, not just because of their economy, but because part of their culture. And so my mother proceeded to do all the sort of things that, you know, planted a garden. We had a cow, we had chickens, and then to supplement the income, I remember as a little girl, she used to do laundry, not publicly, but there would be people now and then that wanted some things done, so she would do some laundry. And then when she first came, which was interesting, before I was born, she went to work as a waitress down at the Wangam Hotel. It was down across from the Maples where the current firehouse was. So she worked as a waitress, and then they were married and proceeded to set up the house. And the other thing that she did was, in later years, it was quite common at that time to take in boarders. And we had the large house.
Where was the house?
That was on North Elm Street. My father had first, when he had first come, had this grandiose idea of having a garage. And I don't remember the garage at all. I was just a little girl at that time. He and my mother's brother had a garage where the cement block building became the community studio later in years. And so they had a garage, but apparently that wasn't successful. And they subsequently gave that up. And my father then worked for the power company for years. He worked for the power company almost up until the time he died when he was 40. He was a young man when he passed away. And one of the boarders that we had, which is why I happened to ask you about the airport, happened to be Ted White. Ted was one of the early pilots that came to Canaan, and he was looking for a room, and he grew up, I grew up with him as being practically a member of the family.
He was a long-term
he was a
boarder.
long-term person, boarder. He did not have a family that we knew of particularly, and so he lived with us. And of course, my uncle was living with us at that time. He was killed in 1939. They were building the bridge going to Ashley Falls, and a large reel of wire fell off of the truck.
Oh, wow.
And he was killed at that time. But growing up in the years that, as I said earlier, when people were talking about the Depression, we never felt that. And a piece of that, I think, was due to the cleverness of my own family, the camaraderie, the people sharing things, which was very nice. One of the interesting things that happened, and I reflect on many times, because my mother came as a very young girl and anticipated becoming Americanized. That was her wish, and her family, of course, it was very common for the immigrants to want their children to be Americanized. And so she immediately, as did my father, wanted to learn to be, they became citizens immediately, and wanted to learn to read and to be part of the community. And as a result, I learned to read when I was 4 years old, because she became acquainted with the school folks, and they gave her books, and she began to read, and I began to read with her, and that was a lovely relationship as an early child. And the one thing that, having to take a job as a waitress, that was prior to my birth, of course. She had to, be fluent in English. She was able to make her way very early in life in that respect. And a couple of things that we remember, the gentleman that, Ted White, that came and lived with us, I was one of the first children in the town to take an airplane ride to New York. And I think how brave it was of my mother to allow me to do that, because I was only 9 years old at the time, and we had to fly to New York in an open cockpit.
Oh, how fun.
It was a Waco. And I remember vividly having the parachute strapped onto my back, and the helmet, that all the pilots' helmets that were worn, leather helmets. And the funny part of it is, as I reflect on it, I would have had no more idea how to jump out of an airplane if I had to. And of course, airplanes used to fly much lower at that time, but Ted had been very fond of me as a little child and used to take me to the airport frequently, which was great fun because he instilled in both my sister and I. My sister was born 4 years after I was born, and she also became interested in airplanes, and we both took flying lessons as young children, which was
very unusual.
It was unusual. Another memory that I have of sort of encapsulating the whole immigrant philosophy, it was the Canaan, and I can't remember, I believe it must have been the bicentennial of Canaan, and we had a big parade. And I remember the floats. At that time, it was quite spectacular to put together all the floats representing the various community activities. And we had the Italian Society, and my mother was the queen, and was supposed to be Queen Isabella. And it's pertinent being Columbus's 500th year this year. And all the ladies of the Italian Society were her ladies in waiting, and that was such a spectacular float. But I had the good fortune to be on a float with Louis de Barberry. And at the time they had the fruit store, and the float was covered, literally covered with grapes, and we were all dressed in authentic Italian outfits. And that was a real nifty kind of a memory to have.
That's wonderful.
It was. It's a lovely memory because there was the camaraderie. The Italian society, which is interesting, and you may have talked with other people about it, but the immigrants that came here developed a relationship amongst themselves, and the fraternal society, and then subsequently the female group, the Ladies Italian Society, used to meet at that point. They used to meet in homes, and then when our house, the downstairs, the garage was long gone, and they created a meeting room there called the Community Studio. And the Italian people, the Italian men, it was a fraternal organization where they would all get together and talk over probably, I wasn't old enough to remember what they talked about, obviously, but in retrospect, probably the condition of the world, and at the time there was unrest in Italy and Europe. But it was also an insurance, and the men the treasurer would go around all the houses, and my husband remembers that because his father was a treasurer, and he'd go with him to collect the weekly dues, like maybe $1 or whatever they were. It wasn't very much, and then they would meet, and if someone was ill or became incapacitated, their insurance would augment. Of course, this was in the days, I suppose, before Social Security.
Well, that's incredible. No, we don't have these memories.
Yeah, and so the Italian Society was very active for many years, and then the women had the Ladies Italian Society, and they did the same sort of thing, and of course they'd provide baskets for sick families, but the other thing they would do would be to provide nurturing and sustenance to new people as they came. And I remember my mother being the president. Many of the immigrant women that came, because they came from the Italian culture where the male was the dominant person in the family, and women were definitely supposed to be the people that, you know, took care of the men. Right. And my mother was not that kind of a lady.
She wasn't.
She was a very independent woman, and learned early on to speak English, as I said, because she wanted to be part of the world and community of this country. So I remember her being president, and I remember her talking with the other women and sort of cajoling them, you know, into, you're in America, you really should be talking English, and that sort of thing. Another memory that I have was connected with a school. There was a lady by the name of Crowfoot, Miss Crowfoot, and she was the school supervisor. And one year there were a great many youngsters that, not great many, but they were children of the immigrants primarily, who needed a summer school program. And so in the studio downstairs in our house, Jeannie Beaujean gathered together a group of people, and they tutored young folks, and to make sure that they could keep up. Many of the immigrant children would always be retained a year because the language discrepancy would slow them down.
I wanted to ask you about that. You're obviously telling me that your parents encouraged the use of English. Did they continue to teach or speak Italian in the home, or were you folks encouraged only to speak English?
No, we were encouraged to speak English, but one of the sad things was that we were always encouraged to keep the native language alive, and we of course felt kind of poo-pooed that idea that it wasn't, you know, it wasn't necessary. But our family always spoke to us in Italian, and to this day I still remember Italian. And being from the northern part of Italy, the Italian was a little purer than the southern Italian dialect would have been, and they did encourage me a great deal. In fact, I remember my father reading Dante's Inferno to me and saying, well, you must keep up with Italian, it's going to be important to you in some time.
So many times it's lost within a generation or two, and it's really sad, you know, that people don't keep their cultural heritage within the family. But it sounds like they tried to have the best of both worlds.
They did indeed. And the other thing that was very interesting was that they, with my mother and father both being acclimated to community affairs, they became active members of the church. My father had been a Protestant, which was quite different. Most of the immigrants were Italians. I mean, we're Catholic folks, and most of the immigrants were Italians, excuse me, at this point. And so we became very active as young people. My mother and father joined the church, and encouraged church activities, encouraged scouting activities. My mother was a Girl Scout leader, and you know, many of the things that had been done. The language, I think it was a disappointment to them that neither my sister nor I kept up with our Italian, but we didn't see the value of it at that time. My uncle spoke fine English also. He worked at the lime quarry. He was a furnace tender. And that was a great treat because we used to live on the corner of Daisy Hill Road, and the lime kiln was up on Daisy Hill, and it was really a pleasure and a treat to prepare my uncle's lunch with my mother, and I'd bring it up to the furnace. And at that time, when you're little, the roaring furnaces were so spectacular. And one of the things that I remember of both my parents and my uncle was their eagerness to be sure that education was important in our lives. And they always made an effort to provide educational experiences. Early on in our lives, both my sister and myself were encouraged, you're always going to college. You know, that was a given. Wherever the money came from, that was a given. And I look back and I think to myself, that was one of the mitigating factors, I think, that they felt was important. I mean, they had a high regard for education anyway, coming from fairly well-educated people in Europe, but that was a real plus, you know, that we were encouraged, and many of the Italian children were not given that. They were told, you must go out and work, and you must help make money for a family. Because that was tradition.
Not only tradition, but it was an economic necessity for many of them.
Absolutely.
You know, it wasn't an easy haul to come to Canaan and set up a whole new life in a whole new world and learn a new language and raise your children in a it must have been very tough. Henry Pizzetta's stories of his father and how his father worked hours and hours and hours at backbreaking labor. It instilled in him what was a very obvious respect for the work ethic and taking care of your family the best way you can. And it sounds like both generations in his family did fine. You know, he raised fine children, and then Henry turned around and raised fine children. So it's a very, very impressive thing to hear about how these families came over and fit in. One of the things I've asked other folks who had the immigrant experience in their family is whether they ever had a sense of prejudice in the town, and whether they ever felt a separation between the various cultural groups in town.
It's interesting that you asked that, because I have heard that, but never did I ever experience that. And I've thought about that many times, because there are friends within my circle of friends and people that have long gone that did feel a prejudice. And I think the thing that happened was that when I mentioned the Italian societies for the men and the women, they were still trying to hang on to some of that heritage. They still, and unless they made an active effort to become integrated within the society of Canaan, I think that's where some of that prejudice. I never experienced that. I never did. The one thing that I remember, another funny little memory, was that the Italian people always had their children wear long dresses, and that was one thing, with long stockings and high shoes, and I remember my mother saying, you know, I had to dress. She never purposely made an issue about dressing like an American child, but definitely it was short dresses and socks and shoes and the sort of Shirley Temple curls, because it was the era of Shirley Temple. And
so she didn't do anything that physically differentiated you. She encouraged the language, she encouraged the clothing, she encouraged activity in the town, and when you did that, you weren't setting yourself apart as some of the other children were set apart.
Indeed, and becoming active members in the church community, where she was a minority, and became more involved with the Protestant ethics that many of the Catholic
Did she
people.
become a Protestant? Or?
Yes, she did. She both and my.
That again is unusual because usually the Catholic Church prefers to gather those who have strayed into their fold rather than the other way around.
No, my father did and she did, and they were taken into the church when Frank Landolt was here, whom we just visited, who is still alive and is 86 years old.
Wow.
And so that was another memory. He became a very close friend of our family. I babysat their children, and he was a minister here for some years, and they became good friends of our family. And another factor that made the Americanization or the feeling of becoming real active community members.
So even though your parents were active in the Italian sect of the town, they were also reaching out into the other kinds of social activities. Did you then immediately start drawing friends from all ranges of the town? So,
Indeed, I did.
Was that a normal experience, or did a lot of the Italian children remain kind of in the enclave?
I think it depended on the age. If you came and you were already close to age 16 and were close to quitting school and didn't have a language, the language facility, school was very difficult. So many of the immigrant children quit school at 16 and went to work. I remember the girls going to work over at Twin Lakes, some of older girls than I, but they would quit school and they'd work over at the Smith, can't think of her name, but it was Smith. They ran a summer resort. Many of the girls did that. Many of them worked as housekeepers or cooks, or there wasn't that much manufacturing in the community, but quite a few went to work in Winstead in the clock shops, Torrington. The youngsters that I associated with primarily were all growing up, were children of community members. And one of the things, another factor that I think caused this, my father being active in the community and the power company, became friends with many local folks. The other part of that was that you were talking about the eagerness to make things work out for families when prices were Depression era, really. My father used to do wiring, and many of the Italian folks that were here, he did that as an after work means, I suppose, to augment our livelihood. And he wired almost all of the houses of the Italian people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that lived in the area. And when I first mentioned about looking out for each other, I remember distinctly, sometimes he wouldn't get paid. He would get something, you know, food, cow had been butchered, or pig, or sausage, or salami, or something of that sort. It was a memory that when he died, and he died when he was 40, so many people would come and say, oh, I remember your father so well because he wired our house. The other thing that he did that was, because he liked to sing and he played the trumpet, he was part of a band that they used to have in Canaan. The Italian Society had a band. And he also sang in the Litchfield Choral Union Club, and was an active member in that. And all of those activities promote assimilation into a community. He did not ignore the friends from Italy. One of the fondest memories I have is of my uncle taking me on a Sunday afternoon up to Dealey Road. They had a bocce alley. Bocce, of course, was a great pastime for the Italian men. And he would take me every Sunday afternoon to watch the men playing bocce. And the other thing that they frequently had, and it wasn't just the Italian people, and I don't know if you've talked about the kitchen dances they used to have.
Yes, Mr. Segalla, Louis.
Yeah.
No.
Stanley?
Stanley.
Maybe remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. That, the Italian people did that. They would, and it was always so impressive to me. And they'd sprinkle cornmeal on the kitchen floor, move out all the furniture, and they'd have a kitchen dance, and singing, and not rowdyism. Even though the Italian people all drank wine and made their own wine, that was a big event in their lives. of course, they grew up, it was part of their culture. But I never remember drunken people. The parties were fun, but I don't ever remember seeing them abusing.
Well, I was reading something last year when I took Jeremiah over to France. I was reading about the use of alcohol in France and also in Italy, that was mentioned in there. And it said that so many of the societies where the use of wine is habitual and family-oriented do not develop the rates of alcoholism that happen in other countries where alcohol is set apart and used either as a special occasion or as a release from something. When it's integrated into the life and you have a certain expectation about how it will be used, then that doesn't lead, even though it's more frequently used perhaps than in other societies, it doesn't lead to alcoholism. And that made sense to me, because one of the things that I've read about alcoholism in the past is that anytime there's a conflict built in around its use, you have much more likelihood that it will be abused than where it is just, well, okay, you have a glass of wine with your meal.
Right. We were never encouraged to drink wine. It was, and I remember my father diluting their wine too. But on occasion we'd be given a sip. But I think it's, I agree with you. I think that there was a healthy respect. It was a beverage, not to be abused, but just a common ordinary drink. You mentioned, or we started talking a little bit before about education, and I mentioned about the summer school that we had, that I was too little at that time. I was only 5, and but the youngsters were meeting down at the community studio, and I went down, and I was kind of a hanger-on because I had already learned how to read, and so my mother had suggested that perhaps they should let me be part of this group. So I was. Consequently, I never went to first grade. They moved me right into second grade because an early reader was kind of, well, it's interesting in any culture. But I've often reflected on my life having gone into education. The way that we used to work in school, and I remember Miss Colligan, our third grade teacher. We had any person who was a very interested person in reading or any of those skills, the early academic skills, we used to tutor. It was each one teach one philosophy, and one of the interesting facets of that was there was a young man who had real difficulty. He was like probably in 8th grade because he was 16, but not because of his ability in reading. And he would come down to 3rd grade, and we'd go outside and we'd read in the hallway or do times tables. And there were any number of us that used to do this tutoring that was great fun. One of the other memories that I have of the elementary school was the fact, and we didn't appreciate it then, but as I became more involved with education in life, I realized the kind of training that was required of teachers at that time was mostly just a normal school. It was 1 year beyond high school. But they brought with them the teachers that I remember, Gladys Bradshaw and Helen Smith, Helen Smith, Jeannie Beauchamp. These were people, Gertrude Huggins, these were people that had limited kind of training, and yet they afforded us the opportunity to learn all the basics that were so important in our lives. And today, the whole philosophy of school, we fragment our educational program by making sure children get so many of the skills that once were part of family living, that we have ended up with a more technical, more demanding kind of preparation to teach school. And I'm not sure that, as fine of the teachers that we have many excellent teachers, we've become so fragmented that
Carmela Segalla has argued with me, or not argued with me, but has said to me in the past that one of her problems with the current teacher preparation is that they're not adequately prepared in the basics, that the basics are kind of forgotten, and then there's this overlay of other information put on top of it. And I would be willing to agree with her based on the kind of writing that I get from the kids who are coming through the system now. I always get very bright reporters. That's, you hire a dumb reporter, and they usually come from pretty good schools, but their language preparation is not strong. And after a couple of years of writing information for consumption that has to really convey an idea, because they're no good to me if they can't tell the public what they know, they tighten up their writing, and it becomes better, but it's practice in the basics. And they've got wonderful educations on top of a very shaky foundation.
I would agree with that, and one of the things that happened was that I think as families, if we come to current days, and I'm a strong believer that one of the things that increased our writing and listening and thinking skills were that we were not the age of television. We had to develop our own exciting thoughts. We had, you know, the radio programs, Jack Armstrong and Stella Dallas, and I remember now as I see the youngsters eager to go home to watch the soap operas in the afternoon, I recall very well wanting to listen to Orphan Annie, and it wasn't much a fetish, but we certainly were intrigued. But just hearing the language and having to conjure all the action in your mind, and those were exciting times.
I'll tell you a funny story. You remember, of course, that Jeremiah had reading difficulty. He had a disability, and God bless Alice Finney, because I credit her with what happened, which was ultimately success over this thing. He reads fine now. But when he was little, he refused to read anything. He was just so traumatized by the trouble of reading that he refused to read anything. And he was in 6th grade when we had our breakthrough, and he started reading it for pleasure, found out it was fun. Well, about, 8 months, 9 months, maybe even a year later, he was laying on the couch reading one day, and he looked at me and he said, "You know, Mom, a book is so much better than a movie because I can make these be anything I want them to be." And I thought, well, you got that one, didn't you? You know, your world is in your control when you read. And there's so much more to be had than the superficial image that we get on television or in the movies. And he rarely, I have to say, he rarely watches television now. He spends most of his time with a book. And so it was a major, major event in our life when and I wrote Alice because she hadn't seen him for 2 years, and I wrote her and I said, "I want to thank you because this would never have happened without you, and I want you to know that you succeeded." And I think that it was an incredible story, the way that they worked with him and eventually taught him to overcome his problems.
You see, that would have been, had that been in place in the 30s, we would have probably far more people having the skills in reading. But of course at that time too, most of the Italian families had large families, and they had to work to create the wherewithal to live. Another memory that I recall is the fact that there was a choir in church, and I became very active in that.
And we're right through my youth because you were my choir director.
I was involved in choir even later on. The other thing that was a real treasure in our family was that my mother and father had friends in New York and Pittsfield and Schenectady and Waterbury and Hartford, and the joy of my life, in fact, I was hardly ever home because in those days, while camp I'm sure existed, it wasn't our priority. But I would spend a week in Pittsfield with friends, I would spend a week in Waterbury, I would spend a week in New York, I would spend a week in Hartford, I would spend a week in Schenectady, and a week in New York. And one of the nicest memories I have, and I'm sad that it doesn't happen anymore, but the train used to run, of course, and it wasn't at all unusual for my mother and father my mother, by that time my father was dead, but she would allow me to get on the train and go to New York by myself.
Wow.
Get myself out to Brooklyn on the subway. Well, my father had done it first with me, but once we had gotten the trip underway, I was allowed to do that independently. And
how old would you have been at this time?
I would have been 10, 12.
Wow. To think that it was safe.
Yes, it was safe. In fact, I laugh about it now. One night I got on a train, or afternoon it must have been, because you take the morning train to New York, and I was headed to Brooklyn, and I ended up in Bronx. And I think back, I was about 13 at that time, and I think back on that. I had the, you know, the sense that I was in the wrong direction, and got back, and I thought, we never, even now, our children are all grown up, but as they were growing, we would never have allowed them to go to New York alone.
Well, Jeremiah went to Bangor 2 nights ago on a bus, and he had to change in Boston. And he's 6'3" now, and he's a big boy, but he's got a Winnie the Pooh face. He's a very gentle-looking kid. And I'm standing there like some worried hen saying, now, don't talk to anybody. Don't, you know, go to the information booth if you need anything. Don't go anywhere with anyone. And I thought, isn't this something when you've got a 6'3", 16-year-old and you're worried about him changing buses in Boston? But I was. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, it's a different world that we're raising our children in, and it's a sadness because we have become, as much as you want to keep the trusting attitude with people, you also are aware whether, and I think television and radio and life in general has changed so much, but the media has become so much a part of our lives that we're exposed to things that we never, probably our parents knew about it, but we didn't know about it. Another thing that my mother did that was a lovely memory and was part of both my sister and my life was when she, I believe the Wangam Inn went out of business, and there used to be fraternal organizations, and there was the Canaan Exchange Club, and she started catering, and it was something that was to have become very important in her life after my father died, because both my sister and I were young when he died. I was 14 and she was 10, and so catering became a way of supplementing our income. And both my sister and I used to have to wait on tables. And the businessmen, the Canaan Exchange Club, it was when they were first starting, always sang after their meal. And because I had some piano experience, Henrietta Parati used to play piano, and then when she retired, they used to have me play, and it was a way to learn all the old songs, the traditional American, early American kind of songs, and that was a nifty experience. And I, of course, at that time, while we had our the Canaan school, and I mentioned the teachers that we had, my class was the first class that went as freshmen to the high school. And that was quite an experience, you know.
Prior to that, my mother has told me, and others have too, that prior to the development of the regional school system, that kids in Canaan knew kids in Canaan and rarely knew kids from other towns. Now, by the time you went in as a freshman, that was the 3rd or 4th year of regionalization, right?
No, it was the first year of regionalization. I went as a freshman.
Oh, that's right.
In 1939, yeah.
Okay, so that's
Your
right.
mother would have gone in as a senior or senior.
That's right. Okay. So that would have been a real shock for you to have moved into that whole wider spectrum of students.
It was, but it was easier for us because we were all in the same boat and we were all freshmen. There was always that big separation between 8th grade and high school to begin with. And the kids feel that today. Children, you know, live in fear and trepidation to go down to regional. Not so much now because there's so many more community activities that assimilate
we have
those
the sports
children. We have the
programs now
sports,
that
right?
get kids out.
Yeah, and that gets the youngsters out earlier, and they're also having 5th and 6th grade and 7th and 8th grade dances and things of that sort that the children travel to those schools. But it was very difficult, and originally when we all went down as from Canaan, we pretty much stayed together. But then the youngsters that I was friendly with, we began to go on beyond our Canaan friends and make good friends, and I think most of us developed very strong friendships through those 4 years. We had the advantage of the 4 years, of course. Unfortunately, the war came along, and that made a difference in what happened in some of our lives.
I have heard that as they got up into the upper grades, a lot of the young men were pulled out or encouraged to go right into the service without getting a degree.
That's right. We had a couple of boys that were killed in the service. And for the most part, though, the girls, most of them all stayed. And we recently, well, it's 5 or 6 years ago now, had a reunion. And it's interesting to note the number of people that still have ties with the community, even though they might have gone elsewhere to school or to work. At that point, there was still, I think, the feeling of remaining in the community. There were jobs that you could come back to. Most of the girls that graduated, or a large number of them, either went on to school, or a good number of them went to Hartford to work in the insurance businesses.
As did my mother.
Yeah, quite a few girls did that.
That leads to
but they come back.
Yeah.
They came back.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, about 10 years, maybe 12 years ago, I did a feature for the paper, because you always hear there's no jobs here, everybody has to leave. So I decided that one way to test that theory was to go and to a 10-year class reunion and see where they were. This was a kind of a surprise, because I found about 85% of the graduates of that class were still local in the six-town region, and that many of them had gone away and come back. So there were about 15% that were permanently gone. And that's really not a very high percentage.
It really isn't. And while the job market has changed significantly, there were enough service needs and enough people that went into business for themselves here. And it drew them back. And I think there were enough people that had gone to school, even though it was a regional school. I think they maintained a closeness to their community, and their families were still here. And it's one of the things that I see changing today.
Yes, I think that is one of the major.
And I think that is what has changed the complexion of Canaan, even though we had the lime quarries, and even though we have that still goes on, not to the degree that was happening at that time. But I think another thing that happened, there weren't as many young people going off to college. And once you become trained for a more technical kind of livelihood, you have to go where that is. And that was probably what drew most of our young people away. The school, I think with great fondness of the North Canaan School, because Center School on Granite Avenue, because there was a camaraderie not only of the immigrant families, but there were so many things that were done because you didn't have the outside forces pulling you away from the school. You had sports, you know, played basketball down at the town hall, and there was Girl Scouts and that sort of thing, but you didn't have the television that would take kids into another realm of activities. Dances were just about unheard of. You'd have Christmas parties, and a lot of effort was put toward recognizing the holidays. I remember I was so impressed because we had Armistice Day, which most youngsters don't even know what Armistice Day is today, but we could hear the town clock, and it was a real exercise on Armistice Day, that at 11 o'clock on the 11th month, the 11th hour, the 11th day, we all had to stop and be very quiet. And it's the recollection of so many of the holidays that schools, you didn't have some of the other things. So the holidays were revered in a broad sense of the word. And you didn't have midwinter vacations, and they were always geared around holidays. And I think that lent itself to community. I
think there was also a different ethic that went on at that time. A couple of years ago, actually just before he died, it's about 6 years ago, I found my father's letters written home. My grandmother had saved every one of them, apparently, and I found the box. So it was kind of a funny experience, because as he was literally dying in that house, I was reading about him in his own words as an 18-year-old, and accounting to his parents, which was really kind of funny, you know, explaining why he hadn't gotten a good grade and promising to buckle down and all of those things. But one of the things that was loud and clear in the letters was that he had been raised to expect to be of service to his community. He was away at school, but he was involved in a firefighting brigade. He was involved in patrols of different kinds. He was involved in social activities. And when he came back to Canaan after the war, Frank Whiting started to train him and groom him to become warden of the fire district. And it was not with the expectation of money. It was with the expectation that this was what you did if you were an active citizen in your town. You don't see that anymore, except for possibly in the fire company where they have their junior firefighters as an effort to recruit people for the future. I think that the 1960s and early 70s kind of killed that sense of community obligation and replaced it with this hedonistic me first, what are you going to do for me now, and then with the expectation that government is going to take care of everything. And my personal, I'll get off the soapbox in about 5 seconds, my personal feeling is that a good hard recession is the best way to reverse that, because what we're already seeing is that towns have had to reduce their budgets as much as possible so that some of the things that we need to continue as a community are now being brought to the community by volunteer effort. And so I think it's got a hidden benefit to have a nice hard recession, even though I'm not enjoying it terribly. I don't know quite how, other than that need to start working for the town, again, you're going to start bringing young people up with an expectation that they must work for their town or their country or whatever.
I'm not sure that it's just the town. I don't think families are instilling that in the children, that the family should take care of itself. And I think the logical progression of that, if you look not just at immigrant families, although everyone was an immigrant family at one time, I was instilled with the same feeling from my family. You are put on the earth to be of some good. You are put on the earth to be a giver, a doer, and not a taker. And if you have that instilled in you, without always a monetary reward coming from it, you begin to be part of that giving, because it enriches your life in other ways. And I think I couldn't agree with you more today. Many people that I think might be contributing, more strongly contributing to the growth of the community, are so caught up in trying to economically survive. We don't have I don't think we have the number of young people that, for example, sew. They don't plant gardens. No one keeps a cow, because in many instances you can't. The zoning regulations, it costs as much to keep a cow as it would to buy the milk. And so why get involved with that sort of thing? There are things that draw us away, things that I recall, and I speak of this often. When we were first married, we were so pleased, and that was 45 years ago, but we were so pleased to furnish a house with bits and pieces. We had a new refrigerator and a new bed, and all our wedding gifts that furnished the small things of life, and a new radio. And that's all we had new. The young people today getting married must have a new television, must have a new couch, new sofa, new chairs, new everything. They don't start out with the sense that we start small and get big. They start out with we get big, and unfortunately
then we struggle to stay there.
Struggle to stay there, and that makes it very difficult. And I think we could expound on what made that happen. With education, I think we showed youngsters that there is more to be had for your own well-being. I don't think we stress enough in education, and I think that might have been a piece of the problem. Because of education, many times, what is it going to do for you?
Well, that's exactly
not what
the point.
Is it going to do for the country, the state, the home, the town. It's difficult. For example, when I was growing up, there were always people willing to go out door to door to collect for Red Cross, Cancer Society, or whatever, all the societies, primarily Red Cross, I remember that. And today you get a letter asking for a donation. Girl Scout leaders and Boy Scout leaders, FOSWEB. I mean, I think influenced any number of youngsters. I said Gertrude Huggins. I'm not sure. I think it was Alma Huggins that was our Girl Scout leader for years, and so many of those people, you know, contributed and 4-H. And people don't have the time today to give to that. So it's important, and how to give to our children today the need to become a contributing member of society at large. But the other thing, I know there was Social Security when I was young, because I remember after my father died, my mother was given $10 a month because of the Social Security thing. But I also remember Frank Stevens at that time. It doesn't happen anymore, but at that time you sort of had to have somebody making sure that your mother did not squander the $10 a month.
Dear.
I got $10 and my sister got $7. That was the Social Security stipend at that day, and I remember Frank Stevens being the monitor to make sure, and he would check to make sure that my mother wasn't squandering that money. And that was another thing that my father, once my father had known that he had cancer and was going to die or be short-lived, he thought that somehow my mother was going to have to take care of us as a family again, with no intent of something else being there to help provide, but you as the mother will have to take care of these children. He began to build the milk bar that was where the snack bar is currently up on Route 7, and he capitalized on the fact that my mother was a good cook, had worked in a society of serving people, catering, and waiting on tables, so knew that. So he died prior to the completion of that building, but again, I suppose there were many women in Canaan, but not too many that were aggressively active in business, and my mother was one of the first business people. Rosie DeBarberry, of course, was legend, but my mother was a business person. And another thing that always has come to mind when you were talking about giving to the community, the encouragement of going on for an education when there wasn't the wherewithal in our family. I had to work to go to school, and scholarships were given, but not with the enthusiasm today. They were few and far between at that point, and I have a fond memory because I was one of the few people in Canaan, and after my family was grown, our children were all pretty much, Mark was an infant, but the University of, I had not finished college, and University of Connecticut opened their branch in Torrington in 1955. Mark had been born, and I decided to go back to school. And it was very common for men to be in college that had come back from the war, but it was not common for women to return to school. And I remember Andy Fair would see me all the time and say, "Aren't you ever going to stop going to school?" That was a standard joke, and indeed it was many, many years, but because it took a long time to get a degree when you were doing, you know, trekking into Torrington or into Hartford to continue and further your education. But education was of such prime concern in our family that I think it was a legacy that it was a legacy that had to be fulfilled from my family, and for many years I thought I should record this, because I went back to school with 3 young children and a very, very supportive husband, because it couldn't have been done, and many Italian people would never have allowed a woman to go back to school. I mean, your job was in the house, and not even taking a job outside of the house. But it was my good fortune to be able to do that, and to be able to have the energy, which is another piece of that. And it's a delight to see that's happening more and more to more people.
Well,
now.
I went back.
You're an example.
I went back after Pete and I separated. Dumbest thing in the world was not to finish when I was there at my parents' behest. But I went back, and you know, there was virtually no men in the continuing education. It was almost all females. So that whole thing has changed very dramatically. But I think you were unusual in I was lucky too, although I'm a generation later, but my father never ever thought of anything other than all four of us being educated. It didn't make any difference, boy, girl, whatever. It was college bound or he was going to bust. And I think that was somewhat more unusual in your family's instance, because we've talked to other Italian families, and for instance, Henry's family, he was the only boy, and the girls were required early to quit school and to start helping to support the family so that Henry could be educated. And there doesn't seem to have been any thought that they would go on even into the high school level. Now, by the time you're a little bit younger than that, by the time you came along, did you see more young women being educated at the high school and then the college level, or was it still pretty unusual for a girl to go on?
By the time I was in high school, it was quite common to go on to school. The one thing that happened was the wherewithal wasn't there because of wartime. And the war effort, we all were kind of taken up with doing doing what you could for your government and for the war. And in fact, I didn't have enough money to go to school at that time. My father, of course, had passed away, and my mother didn't. We had the milk bar at that time where we worked, so I had to work a couple of years, and I had the very good fortune of we had a friend that lived in Pittsfield. One of the ladies that I used to spend my weeks with as growing up worked at the GE, and they were always looking for engineering helpers. And so, because there were no young men, no young engineers, so I was very fortunate to go into work in the GE during a couple of years before, and then I kind of tired of that and decided to go to Hartford, and I worked at Pratt & Whitney. There were people at that time driving back and forth from Canaan to work in the night shift, so I did that for a few months. I thought that was kind of exciting. And then I still didn't have enough money, so I went to work at the magnesium plant, worked with Jesse Branch in the lab, and that was a blessing in disguise, because the men weren't there, the young engineers, the young folks that would ordinarily have done that. So if a girl showed or a woman showed any interest at all in the science field, and was willing to do some of the mundane jobs, running tests and things of that sort. And we were allowed to do that. And it could have been a turn of events. At that time, engineering was not as popular, but I had been offered a full scholarship from the GE to go on to be an engineer. And
you just weren't interested in that?
I was very interested in science, but somehow a female engineer was not my idea at that time. I was going to go into nursing, but I was too young to get into nursing school. And so I passed up that and then ended up getting married. We're going to college for 2 years and then ending up getting married instead, which was appropriate, and but then having the good fortune to go on to school, which was due to the fact my mother was still alive at that time and was supportive, and I had a supportive husband, and Torrington Branch opened. So it all fell into place. It all fell into place quite nicely. G. Wilbur Stowe went back to school at the same time to become a minister, and so there were a few of us that pursued that.
Now, when you were interested in going on to school, so this may not have affected you too much, but when the men came marching home again, did you find that generally women of your generation were happy to move out of the workplace and back into the home, getting married, having children, and more or less being homebodies, or did you find that was a problem for some of them?
I think it was a problem for some, but not for most. I think we had grown up with traditional family in mind. You go to school, you get married, whether you were of immigrant parents or native parents. And most of my friends did indeed. Many had completed their education. I hadn't, but interestingly that you asked that question, because that's what happened to me. I left college because my boyfriend at that time did come home from the service, And he was older than I, and it was part of his life to settle down and raise a family and you know, have a family, have a home. And so I did leave school and pursued all the other kind of home things that you do. And it was later, as I said, when our son Mark, I'd had Elena, who was your age, and Tina, and then Mark was born. The branch opened. My desire to continue my education, I was happy as a mother, obviously, but the sense to continue school was paramount in my mind. And I really think it wasn't just my own interest, because I always like to learn, but I think that I saw continuation of education as a way to give back. That sense of community, that sense of giving was very important, and I think that's one of the reasons. Always wanting to be a teacher, it was interesting, and I think many people go through this. You find your vocation. You have conceived ideas of what you think you might want to do in life, and you try a lot of things, and then eventually you settle on something that maybe you thought about as a child. One of the things that was very fortunate for many of us, if they had the interest and energy and wanted to pursue it and had the family that would support them. I mentioned that I worked in three places. We were afforded that. Jobs were plentiful. I mean, you wouldn't flit from job to job, but when I first left high school, I went to work at the GE, which was a great opportunity. And I can't say I tired of it. I wanted to come back to Kane in the community, and then went to Hartford, you know, and you had that choice. You could work in the drugstore in the summer. You could work in the. I worked at Hart's 5 and 10 one summer. I worked at we had the milk bar. I worked there. There was just a variety of things that if you had the interest, and it broadens you, and I think that's what gives you the perspective of what's happening.
One of the things that I found in talking, I guess more to the men than the women in doing these interviews, is that a lot of them had a mentor when they got out of high school, and if they weren't going on to college, they would have somebody who, if not a long-term participant in their life, at least at that point helped to guide them into something like the banking industry or some other form of work, and that this was kind of a regular experience, if not a universal experience, that they would graduate and then the business community would absorb them. And now it's more like, how many doors do you knock on before you get a job? I don't think you see that kind of ready absorption into the community. For one thing, the community's changed dramatically. We don't have a particularly active business district right now. We were remarking last week during railroad days that the number of stores that can have a sale are 3, really. There's Pat's and two clothing stores, and you can't have a sale on chiropractic service. You can't. That's right. You know, a restaurant can't really have much of a sale that would attract people to the town. So, if you think back to the number of stores that used to be there that actually sold goods, and then see what we've got now, there's not much.
Very true.
There's not much there that a young person could move into.
You talk about mentors, and of course that is the catchword right now in education. They're looking to have business partnership and mentors. And I think if you were to look at one particular person in your life as a mentor, it would be very easy to find that person in the days that I was growing up. But and those are the sort of things that, as the community expanded within the high school, you wouldn't have a mentor probably from another town. When the school was local, your elementary school was local, and your high school, because that at the high school time is when they're encouraging either to go on for further education or to practice a trade or become more proficient in a technical field. There were those little jobs that you could gravitate toward. But once we had a regional school, you were drawn from the community, and you might have had mentors, but they wouldn't have had that close tie to a family. And I frequently think, because of the educational work that I've been doing these past years, how do you find mentors when they're so busy taking care of their own businesses, their own lives? Many of the people travel to jobs, and the youngsters, if they're not part of that circle, part of that sense, they don't look to people as mentors. And I think frequently children had their own parents as mentors, and you mentioned Henry. The family is so fragmented now that in many instances, I always, when we talk about this, I always have to reflect and say, there are still very strong families. And we hear so often of the negative, but there are still very strong families, and they are still leading their children in ways of community and sharing. But the economic situation is making such a drastic change in lives.
Well, what you have is you can have a two-parent family that is pretty fragmented by the fact that the parents, I have one young family over at work for me, they're adamant that their child won't be taken care of by daycare. I personally think they're making a mistake, but they're adamant that the child will not be taken care of in a daycare situation. So he works during the day, she works at night. Now, that's as fragmented as having a single-parent family, and I personally think they would do better if Christine put the baby in a daycare situation for 2 or 3 hours and went out and did her business, and then they spent time together subsequently. But they have this image of what they want for their baby. Well, God bless them. At least they care enough to have something that they do. But I think also that what we forget about the past is that many times in the past, families were fragmented also by death of a parent, as in your instance, or by some other circumstance, and that a lot of the people that grew up in the supposedly halcyon days of Ozzie and Harriet were dealing with some kind of disruption in the family situation, and that we also produced strong people then, and we'll produce strong people now. So I'm not as much of a pessimist about that as some people are. I think that I've been watching the kids that have come through with Jeremiah, and I think they're all basically fine young people who have got some growing to do, but are basically fine young people. I think what society is not supplying is that next level of support. And I think Joe Deutschel, for instance, who hires many of the young people in Canaan now, is a shining example of what we are lacking. Because when Jeremiah started his first day there, I was so impressed. Joe called me, and he said, Jeremiah's here on his first day, and everything's fine, don't worry, but I like to talk to the parent. I like to find out if there's anything I should know about this kid. And then he said, I will continue to communicate with you if there are any problems, or if he's having any problems, call me. And I thought, isn't this incredible? This is this boy's first venture into work. And here's a guy who cares enough to make sure that we are working together to have him successfully enter the workforce. And it's happened. It took him about a week and a half. Joe said it would take 2, so he was right on target. It was a little like breaking a colt to harness, how he did kick and squirm. But he's now hooked on making money, and I think we'll have a successful worker there. But Joe is the kind of person that used to greet young people, I think, coming out of schools, and that doesn't happen all the time anymore. I don't think.
One of the things that I think makes a difference too, and it's been, I think, a piece of the economy that has caused this to happen, we frequently worked for nothing. That was not at all, somebody needed help, so you helped them, because that was part of your
social obligation.
You were fortunate in being paid when you were paid. And today so many youngsters have grown up, and I think it probably happened after the war. So many changes occurred of the Second World War. Life had achieved such a tempo. People were making huge salaries at that time compared to what the economy is giving now. They weren't huge, but many people suddenly had the wherewithal to begin to enjoy some of the nicer things in life. And once you start enjoying those nicer things of life, you find that it takes money to enjoy those nicer things of life.
So you keep accelerating.
Yeah, for example, I mentioned going to visit families a week here and a week there. Going to camp wasn't a high priority because you had all these experiences and they were free. You know, usually they were young mothers and they were happy to have a visiting little friend come along to help babysit. By the time our children grew up, even though they had some of those experiences, not to the degree that I did, but it was then camp was a big thing. So how do you send children to camp? You have to have money. And then other experiences come along. Many of our youngsters today travel abroad. How are they going to travel abroad if they don't have money? And so it becomes cyclical. All of the experiences that you want children to have, young people to have, require money. How do you get money? You have to work. And
I know the feeling.
you know, and so there seems to be the sense that we to have those things happen, you have to give energy to getting the wherewithal. And I think sometimes that has detracted. There aren't too many youngsters today of high school age that don't do something during the summer, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it allows little precious time to give free time. I recall growing up, it wasn't at all unusual to go and babysit, and you know, you were lucky if you got 10 cents. That was big pay in those days. I look now, our daughter, we have a granddaughter, and the babysitter gets $5 an hour, and she's in high school. But clothes are expensive, and youngsters don't sew. We used to sew a lot. Many Italian people did that, and as I said earlier, that was how you survived during the Depression. You became more resourceful. So it's interesting watching the changes. I think the one thing that saddens me about Canaan is that we somewhere have lost the need to look out for each other. Whether it's been economic, whether it's been the influx of parents, of new people, I mean, whether it's been the loss of the generation of people that grew up with that. You know, there are very few Italian families now that were the original settlers here. Very, very few. That whole generation, we're the older generation of Italian folks now were the firstborn that came here with their parents. But if you think of any number of the families, the Segalla family, all of those men are gone, the Rivas, when Red Riva just died, and his wife, the Delones, the Pizzettas, the first generation to be born here are now the older generation, and and it wasn't just the Italian. There were a lot of Irish people here that I think that grew up and had their families, and they're the older generation, and because they've been busy working with their families, the perspective changes. New people come to the community. You're talking about town, you know, businesses. You don't need those businesses anymore. It's just as easy to go to shop in Great Barrington or Torrington,
which is what we do.
Yeah, we do too frequently. But I remember going to the old A&P, and that was quite an adventure. And you would be given, and even our youngsters don't do this today because you have cars. But I would have to go and, you know, maybe pick up a pound of coffee or something. And even though I only lived probably a quarter or half a mile out of the business district, it wasn't at all unusual to send me down to get something at the store. That doesn't happen too often. Usually Mama gets in the car and
well, you don't walk to the center anyway because there's nothing to buy in the center.
That's other than the market
Yeah.
or the, there were at least 3 drugstores that you frequented, and there was it was Hart's, I remember, and it was great fun.
It's really been the last 2 decades that the change has come about, because when I was a teenager and I dropped out of college, I went to work in Hartford and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. So I came home, and this is how parochial I have always been. I remember walking up the street, because there was a really still active business district at that point. I was going up for something, and I met so many people on the street that I knew, and I thought, this is so much nicer than what I've been doing. And obviously I like that, because I've stayed pretty much in this area ever since. Now, you don't have that, and there are a lot of days when you can walk down the street and not meet much of anybody. And also, as you said, the families have gotten into the 2nd and 3rd generation. I think probably the immigrant families were one of the reasons for the cohesiveness of the community from the turn of the century on, because they had that family tradition, or that ethnic tradition of mutual aid and all of that, which translated to the community as a whole.
Some time ago, and I've often thought she never completed it, and I would like to talk with her sometime to see if we couldn't get it back on track. Carolyn Smedick was putting together a compilation of all the immigrant Italian families, because for many years we thought of the people, the landowners that were what you would consider the village fathers, as the people that were the founders of Canaan. They were, if you go back to the early very early 1800s, but the influx of the immigrants in the early 1900s is what made Canaan. Some of those, the founding fathers that they talk about, they had the wherewithal and they knew the community. They had the money, they owned the property. It was they that owned the lime quarries, it was they that owned the iron, it was they that owned the trees, the land that the trees had to be cut on. But it was the influx of the immigrant families, not just the Italian, but the Irish also, and primarily there's some Germans, but I think mostly the Irish and Italian in this area, that developed this community. They were the workers, the doers, and I mentioned before about my father, an early electrician. That and perhaps there were others, but I remember that so well, because at the time so many people would say, you know, oh, it was your father that gave us our first electric light. The quarries were mined by those families, and I look at the Segalla family and what they did, the lumber or the wood cutting, the activities that they were involved in, and the Rivas. Many of them had farms, of course, but that was, you know, your grandfather. These were the people that sustained the community and caused the community to grow. And you can't reflect on what might have been. You reflect on what was and what you hope can happen again. And I think one of the things that there are young people. I recall and think about Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and those kind of activities. I remember my own life in the church. I see a resurgence of that. I see young people taking a more active role. And it's important to foster that. And you know, babysitting used to be great, and if mother had to go out and work, there was always a granny or an auntie. And this is what has proliferated daycare centers. There aren't those people anymore. Granny is a 35-year-old lady, a 40-year-old lady out doing her own, you know, her own job or whatever she wants to do, education or work. And these young folks don't have that family support to the degree that we grew up with. The other thing that I think we looked out for each other instinctively. We were talking about that the other day. We don't have visiting salespersons anymore. There were 3 or 4 men that used to come around. I expect they came from Hartford or Torrington. I don't remember particularly. But they would come once a month or once a season with their wares and their suitcases. Have you talked with anybody
No.
about that?
No.
They would come and they would open up their suitcase. And I think it was, at that point, I think they were drawn to this area because many of the immigrants didn't speak English. And they would have these people come, and they were traveling salesmen is what they were, and they would open up their suitcase and they'd have linens and towels and doilies and things of that sort. And I look back because I happened to have a doily that my mother had bought, and it was like 5 cents. And there was one gentleman. There was another man that came around and repaired your mattresses. He'd come around. There was another man who probably was from Great Barrington, and he would have his case, a large valise with his little treasures in fabric, and also one of the things that we don't have was two people. One was the DeBarberys. They had a traveling car, a wagon. You know, Joe DeFerrari would come around, or Louis, I can't remember who it was at the time, but they would come every week to buy your fruits and vegetables if you didn't have them in your garden. We had the visiting bread men would come around. We had the milkmen that would come and deliver milk, and that all led toward camaraderie and caring. Because you were part of the family. I mean, your grandfather was as important to us, you know, delivering milk, because if something was, you know, he would be there.
Yeah.
If there was a problem.
Yeah.
And when the bread man came, if there was a problem, he'd visit a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, and those are the sort of things that we don't experience
Well,
anymore.
my mom tells about Grandpa during the Depression not collecting on a lot of the milk that he left with various families who had children and didn't have any money. And she said that all of those people eventually paid him back when they got on their feet. But can you imagine going to the supermarket and saying, I don't have any money, can you carry me for 4 or 5 years?
That's right.
You know, because that's what it was. It was a depression. It went on for a long time.
And they did, but it was that caring.
Yep.
It was that caring, and they probably were suffering themselves.
Well, I'm sure it wasn't easy for them. And she said that they all paid back. That was why she was telling me the story. You know, she was saying, well, he did this, but they did that. They all came through when they were on their feet, and they paid for all of that back milk, maybe a dime a week or something like that. But she was very impressed with the fact that there was that sense of obligation to him for the amount that he had given them. And I think that is starting to erode in this town. I don't know quite how we reverse it, because we can't change American society back 40 years. But I think people have lost a sense of comfort in their town and in their society that was there before. It's still here. I mean, it erupts. If you remember when the Carlson boy's foot was hurt, the community really came forward then. And when my cousin Kathryn was here, who has since died, she couldn't live with us because of her very paranoid feeling about men. She was always sure that my dad was peeping through keyholes at her. So she had an apartment.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Elsewhere. Oh, my father, can you imagine anybody
no, I
more
can't.
gentlemanly?
No, I can't.
But Kathryn had her problems. But Canaan acted as a large asylum, and we were always getting calls. Kathryn needs some help, you know. She's dropped her money in the street. Can you come help her, or something like that? And so Canaan still has that essential feeling for the people. I know Ida takes little Joe to the doctor sometimes. It's still got it, but it's being eroded, and I'd hate to see the accelerating pace of the United States accelerate the erosion here too.
The other thing that happened that we don't have today is that there were large families. You had 5 or 6 people in a family, and today that's very unusual to have 5 or 6 children. But the sense of family goes not only from your family, your close family, your immediate family, but eventually that family marries into some other family, and you become, and I think about this with the Segalla family, for example. I think at present there are probably 240 or 250 that are all part of this, and while they're not all there helping you at one time and another, you know that they are there. And so many of the people that live in our community now are single families. And I think of this with our daughter that lives in Brookfield. She works, her family is all here, and she's developed a small group of friends, but they were friends that she had worked with. Her husband has a group of friends. They have little precious time to become involved in the community because they're busy raising a family and doing those things. And I think that's what happens. We have a lot of women in Canaan that are single parents, don't have time to volunteer. They're lucky to keep their lives together with raising children and having a job. They don't have the grannies and the aunties and the uncles. And one of the dearest memories in my life was having an uncle live with us. And albeit we didn't have a great number of boarders, Ted that lived with us, Ted White, who was a pilot here at the airport, he was always there for a Sunday afternoon activity or going up to the airport and going for a ride. We don't have those kind of things for our children as much anymore. You had to form your own activities, and because of that, it was your own resourcefulness that kept family picnics, for example. I mean, how many people? I don't know. I've not done a survey of it, but we never went any place to eat. That was like the big event of your life if you went out for a birthday, the big event. And we always had picnics. I still have the picnic basket that my mother had that was brimming with stuff, and we used to take this and go picking blueberries and having a picnic, or strawberries or whatever. Wild. Now you go to cultivated area, but kids, what's the big thing today is to go to McDonald's or Burger King or wherever, and those things break down the family. It doesn't allow the time to work together, to prepare together.
Well, I'll tell you one thing, there's this whole sense of the loss of the family, and when I was growing up, remember Myron Rust? Well, I was just always scandalized that Myron's lived with his grandmother and his mother, and that they ate in restaurants. And Julie, guess what? My son lives with his grandmother and his mother, and he eats
in restaurants. See, he was a forerunner he was before his time.
The thing about Myron is that he turned out just fine. But I was thinking about Jeremiah the other day because I love Mexican food, and since he was 4, we have probably eaten at Dos Amigos at least once a week and more often twice a week. And my life is so nuts that Dos Amigos has become our family table. And I thought, I was feeling guilty about it one day, and then I thought, why am I feeling guilty about this? Because we sit across from each other and we really talk to each other during the period of time that we're there. So what difference does it make whether I came home and prepared a half-baked meal? Jeremiah prefers that I not cook, by the way. Or whether I've got him out here. But I do think it's so funny that I was so shocked as a child to think that Myron was living this kind of life, and here it is replicated in my own.
Well, those are the sort of things that probably wouldn't have happened. Were the circumstances different in his life? The one thing that I think, and it's always a philosophical question with school and education, I always have been, in recent years, within the past 2 decades, I guess we could say, the deterioration of teaching of values. It became very common in the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s, that it was not the school's role to teach values. The generation of people that were trained, you could talk about all those things, but values were not to be assigned to them. And if we don't teach values someplace, how are you going to learn them? You can't always depend on the family teaching values, because they don't always have the time. And part of the value structure has changed so because the schools, with the number of agencies that have come into being, that have said it's not your choice to teach the values. So we have taught youngsters knowledge, but not the not the value to go with them. And I think when you're talking about going and eating, for example, it isn't the time that you're spending together eating is great and very special, but the value that was lost was that your son hasn't learned how to cook Mexican food.
Oh,
maybe he does. He probably does.
Do.
But you see, there's a value associated with that, and you know, he's fortunate that you're doing that. But there are some people that eat in the restaurant and give no value to the time of preparation or the time of growing it, nor any of that. And,
well, you mentioned the going out to eat as being the really special thing. With us, the really special thing is getting the meal at home. It's the reverse. And that becomes the huge event, is when we draw everybody together and we all eat. And he's like my father. He wants family all around him all the time. So when the family picnic occurs, which used to be the ordinary thing, that is the special event for him. It went the other way. So I do believe that while we have a changing society, it's not particularly a dark society, because I see the same human needs coming along. And I see people, what I see with the children that are coming through with Jeremiah, who are almost all from separated families. First, they act as a support group for each other. And then, for the most part, the parents of those individual families act as a support for the other children. So we have a reconfiguration of society here where, no, the nuclear family isn't there, but Jason and Matt and all of those kids look to me for some help, and perhaps to Matt's parents for some help, and there's a whole group of people who see these children as kind of an extended family of their own. And some of them are individual children and some of them are from larger families, but they have become, in essence, their brothers. And it's a very, very close relationship for the most part.
See, I would agree with you, and I think that human nature requires, we are a gregarious society. There are individuals that prefer to be alone, but in general, we look to that. The family provided that once. It isn't there, so you begin to make up for it. I've lived long enough. I didn't know that this really happened, but I found out that it does. The wheel does go round, and all of those things. I think the generation of youngsters that you're speaking of lacked that in your years growing up. You had it, you lost it, and then as a young adult and a parent, you suddenly saw that as not intrusion, but as the extended family. And so you related that to your child. That's perfectly all right. I grew up where you looked out for each other, but the family was where you went for that nurturing. You had all these other people that were good to you and would step in, you know, when parents died or had some problems. But the youngsters are far more willing to let other children come into their lives, and I think they're developing that sense of camaraderie to look, and it has to be, because you don't live by yourself. It's a sad life when you live alone. And to the young people, we were just talking of that with our daughter the other day, that all of the things that we were able to do together, even, you know, with the church. There are young people that are again now looking to the church to fill that void. But when you're very busy working, you don't have time to volunteer. Your interest might be there, but you're trying to work and hold a family together, and you don't have the community sense. But it's missing, and I think people want it back.
I think they're looking for it.
They're looking for it again. And you know, it's very easy, and it's very easy for those of us that are in education to so frequently look at the negative side, and we have to remember, yes, there are things that are happening today. The whole revelation of behavior that we know existed before, but has become so much more common today in terms of relationships. And those things happened before. We're just very aware of them now. But we are looking there are people out there looking to help children. There are people out there that want to be mentors. There are people that are sorting out. Joe Deutschel is a perfect example. The school, I think, is beginning to assume, it's gone. Again, here the wheel goes round. For a long time, the school was a place of learning the basics of the education world. Then I remember as a young girl, we used to have health inspection. Once a week, they'd check your fingernails and your hands. Why, I don't know. I don't ever remember. I guess somebody must have gone and washed their hands, or else my hands were always clean.
Now they do drug tests.
Now they do drug tests. And the school began to assume more and more. They put in lunchrooms, so parents didn't have to worry about lunches. They put in after-school latchkey programs, so parents don't have to worry about their children after school. But I'm beginning to see the school is also saying enough is enough. Now, folks, you get out there and start taking care of your own. And it's very interesting that I think, were we to be around in another couple hundred years, I think we'd see the family changing. It's not going to be the same nuclear family. But I think something else is going to come in place. And I think school is going to get back to, our job is to teach, to provide the educational for those youngsters that are so inclined, and other people are going to have to begin to pick up all the pieces. It's sad. That's one of the blessings of television has been, of course, that it's opened up the world for us and has offered so much more to think about. But the flip side of that is also exposed a totally different kind of a world to us that we would never have been exposed to. And it's the ugly sometimes that we see, and that has more value in terms of capturing audiences, you know. But by the same token, I think there's more and more being shown on television that broadens and even enlightens in a different way. It's a medium that has had such an impact, and would that we had greater control, because there are those youngsters that when they are alone, once you'd go next door to Susie's house or something till Mama got home from work. Now it's go into the house and turn on the TV, or fortunately the school and other agencies that are putting together activities, the latchkey kids have a place to go, but we are so aware of inner city problems that we had no idea about. I remember taking the train going down to New York. It was always so traumatic. It was the upper 175th Street, 150th Street, where all the slums were. And you'd think, oh, how lucky to live in the country, you know, and you had no idea of what life was really all about in those tenements. And then today they come into your living room, you know what's going on in all the tenements. So it's enlightening in one way, and yet it also causes a great deal of strain and stress, because you worry, how is that going to affect your children as they grow? We used to have friends in New York, in Brooklyn, again, families that had known our family from Italy, and it was always the highlight of our lives, both my sister and I, to go to New York and spend a weekend. And we got laughing about this. Our son now, of course, is in business of restoration and remodeling, and we were looking through some books. And in the New York tenements, it was this was in Brooklyn, but it was the same idea. It was quite common to have the bathtub in the kitchen. And it came back as the funniest memory, because I thought, I remember that, and I used to think that was the funniest thing. And we got laughing about it because we also grew up in a generation where I happened to have a book with house plans in the 1930s, and bathrooms weren't common in the interior of the house. And I thought, it doesn't seem possible that in 60 years we have changed. Society has demanded so much more in terms of accoutrements in your house. And it's fun to reflect on just how the social, not only the social life has changed, but also I don't ever remember, other than the Canfield Hotel, I don't remember apartment houses in Canaan. They must have been here, but I don't remember them. People had rooms, but nobody divided their house into apartments.
Yeah, and now it's
And now that's the thing to do, and or to have the condominium complex.
We better give his back a break.
Oh,
He has stayed there so
I
quietly.
thought Fred, you'd fallen asleep over there.
He's very patient.
I don't know how long you do this.
I don't know how long we've gone. My watch broke last night.
We've gone an hour and a half.